There was a really good clip from Dave Tate's podcast this last week where he had Mike Israetel on, and they talked about the bare bones of programming. And given that that's been a foundational piece of this channel, breaking apart training programs, talking about better ways to arrange your training and how to make decisions based on what you're trying to do and what your circumstances are, I thought this was very insightful. And it also relates to a lot of the points that I've covered in the past. So I wanted to show this to you guys, break down some of the things that are being said, and added my own 2 cents as we go.
Staying with periodization, because I think that's a topic where there's a lot of basic principles that a lot of people just don't get. Sure. They don't understand. Sure. And then look at the linear models that are out there, very basic, hypertrophy phase, strength phase, peak phase, whatever else I'm forgetting is in your strength phases, right? And then after you do that, look into, block models, bump on stuff. Some of the more basic, because it's your PhDs in this. It's a big rabbit hole. Sure. And then after that, kind of look at conjugate. And then when you look at conjugate, understand what the pitfalls are from that. Then once you understand those three in some type of separate capacity, which they're really not, but they kind of are in a way, because everything's still linear, everything's still blocked, but it's, you get where I'm going here.
Oh, I wrote a whole article.
Yes.
That whole thing. Yeah.
So Dave's talking about understanding things from the perspective of 3 different training modalities. Linear, which is like the most simple principle in training, the most simple arrangement in training, block, and then conjugate. And Mike says right here, he's like, oh, I wrote a whole article about this. And he did. It's been around for quite a while. There's 2 parts, and there is only one type of periodization. And this is a really brilliantly done article, and I think it brings a lot of really valid points to the surface that you might not be inclined to really be aware of when you're off just sifting through all of this endless literature, whether it's informal publications like the stuff I put out, whether it's blog posts, whether it's YouTube videos, or whether you are in the textbooks sifting through just dry rote information, trying to make sense of all of it. So his big premise in this article is really that the way we talk about periodization is messed up, because there really isn't a bunch of different ways to do it. There's the same principles at play, and it's really just how you arrange them, how you dose them, that gives these different flavors. So he basically breaks down and defines periodization. It's how you organize training, pure and simple. And the periods refer to exposing the body to periods of different stressors and more or less total stress over the course of a training plan. So that's periodization. You have periods of high stress and low stress. It could be exercise selection and variability. It could be effort that you're putting out. It could be frequency. All these different dials get turned, and you chunk them into broadly different periods. So really all periodization refers to is organizing training and making decisions about when and what types of stress you place on the body. The article that breaks down what we know is the time scales. Microcycle is a week. Mesocycle is a series of weeks. Macrocycle is your whole plan start to finish, usually from the time you start training to the full realization at an actual contest. Now, this brings up an interesting point. I think it's something that's not talked about a lot. And that is the kind of different faces of periodization, because it is very, very heavily rooted in competitive sport sciences, not even just lifting, but all sports, track and field and team sports, and sports you might get ready for in an Olympic cycle, where every 4 years you're trying to plan how to get ready for the next local show, into the nationals, into the thing that qualifies you for the Olympics. And you have to do that every year, and then still have this big peak every 4 years of this quadrennial cycle. The roots of periodization is actually geared towards sports. And it really concerns itself with how to arrange training in such a way that you can build the qualities you need, get the physicality you need, because just doing the sport isn't enough to do it by itself. And then how you can take that and kind of shove it through this funnel of specificity that takes that physicality and applies it to the thing you're trying to get better at. So if all you just did as a football player is play football, sure, you might get better on some scale, but not nearly as fast as if you dedicate periods of time to emphasizing, say, weight training, getting more explosive through cleans and snatches, agility training, getting your basic coordination, your basic reactive time improved. But at the same time, if you don't arrange these qualities in an appropriate way, if you're going just as hard in the gym and in your agility drills 3 weeks out from your first game as you were at the beginning of the offseason, there's going to be a problem. You're not going to be recovered, and you're not going to have spent enough time refining those sport-specific skills that are the most important come game day. So you will be losing an edge. So this is all about just planning and organizing these traits. Now, the different face of periodization as we think of it is a little more dumbed down because we have the benefit of the thing that we're getting ready for actually being the same as our main developmental driver. So that's kind of nice, but it can also cause us to kind of lose the plot, to get lost in doing this activity over and over, that we forget to address specific skill-based qualities versus broad developmental base building qualities. And that's a lot of what I wrote about. So let's get back to Dr. Mike.
Just real quick, if I may.
Yes, yes.
So first thing you can do when you look at periodization, you just look at all the models separately.
Yes.
And you start to pick out features of them, and you start to figure out sort of obvious downsides. You can look at a purely linear progression and just like add 5 pounds to the bar every fucking time. Starting strength, that's what starting strength is.
Yeah.
And you say, wow, that seems really good. And then if you think it through your mind for another 3 seconds, you go, what happens if I like start missing reps and I can't add 5 pounds to the bar? What happens if a lift becomes stale for me? Like my high bar squats are just fucking grooving, and then they're fucking not grooving, and then my hip kind of hurts, but my knees are okay. My quads are okay. There could be other movements I could use to get overall lower body strength, but my high bar is, for whatever weird hip reason, is a non-starter. Do I still do high bar squats Monday and add weight to the bar by 5 pounds just like always? Linearity breaks down at that point.
And he's talking about linearity in the most fundamental aspect. That's a linear progression where you literally start with an amount of work and you're just adding load in small increments on a set timeline over and over indefinitely. This is probably the dumbest form of periodization, and then it takes the least into account with regards to how you feel and your circumstances and what you're getting ready for. It doesn't shift gears. It doesn't have different blocks built in. You start day one here and you move in a straight line every single session until it just doesn't work. Now, what he's talking about, missing reps, that's inevitable. Now, for beginners, it's not that they need to do this. This is something that always didn't sit well with me with Ripito when he would talk about it. He'd say, well, beginners have to squat 3 days a week. It's like, no. Beginners get better from absolutely everything, but they can do it this way. And because it's structured, because it's idiot proof, and because beginners can bounce back after a day or two and repeat the same stress where an advanced lifter wouldn't be able to, it's a very nice way to get really aggressive, very fast gains in strength in a way that's not going to screw with the individual. They're not going to get hung up on questions or having doubts because it requires some amount of interpretation in the program. So it's a very good method of application for beginners. As you get better, your only option for that is to apply it in short abbreviated chunks, because where a beginner might go 6 months before they hit a wall, as you get intermediate and then advanced, it might only work for 6 weeks at a time or a few weeks at a time. And that's when you're basically looking at a block structure where you can increase the stress linearly, but then you have to deload.
Then you can look at a more extreme version of something else like conjugate. You look at conjugate, or whatever you'd like to call it, concurrent system, and you say, okay, the really good thing about here is there's a huge degree of variation. You'll never be bored, and you'll never be irritating the same structures over and over. Because if something hurts, you train some other angle that doesn't hurt at all.
Yes.
The downside is sometimes you lose track of what it is exactly that I'm trying to do. Well, I'm trying to get strong for one very specific thing that happens at a very specific time. And too much fuckery within conjugate makes people forget what the fuck the point even is. Yes. Like, yeah, man, I hit a 12 board PR with 8 chains tied around my neck. And like, sweet, what's your last bench PR? Like, bench? Like, competition bench? Like, yeah, like, it's fucking years ago. I don't care. I'm getting stronger. Like, how the fuck do you know that? I don't. Meet after meet goes to hell, and you're like, I think we need to come back to more of a semblance.
And this reflects a lot of my critiques about conjugate and West Side style training. My main issue, it's what I was exposed to when I had my gym in Redlands, was new or low intermediate lifters, those with not a lot of competitive experience, those who weren't very strong, getting sold on it because they thought it was like the authentic way to train for powerlifting. And really, they just got excited about the novelty of the variations. It kept things fresh, and it gave them a reason to max out every workout. So programming is very easy. I mean, work up to a max single. That's easy enough. Rotate the exercise. But because it hinges on the exercise rotation, that is such a greater skill that you need to get down, that unless you have somebody to work with directly who has a ton of success with it, especially somebody who has the time to get to know you and how you respond to training, it's going to be a waste of time because you're going to get stuck. You're going to get hung up on the exact exercise selection. So it adds this element of voodoo, because if months go by and you don't progress, well, was I not choosing the right exercises? Was I not evaluating my weaknesses enough? Were the exercise I thought that were going to target my weaknesses doing what I thought they were supposed to do? Maybe it's my accessory. Maybe I'm just one of these lazy snots that, does my 19 board press with the bands wrapped around my neck, like Mike says, but then I skip out. I'm just there for the max effort and the speed work because that's where the real magic is. And then I don't do the extra work that's needed to build size and muscle because that's not really sexy, bro. But it goes to show that every broad style of training that we have a sense of, it has some limitation. It has something that has to be worked around. So in that way, it's not really that any of them are better or worse. It's that they have different applications to different populations. They're going to be more or less appropriate for different types of lifters.
So at the end of the day, whatever the demand of the sport is, and the different even types of powerlifting have different demands. For equipped lifting, because almost all of the weights you're lifting are above 100% of your raw max, the amount of systemic fatigue you get from even one repetition makes that linear progression out of the gate impossible. Can you imagine a system where like squat 900 for 5 Monday? Hey, what do I do next Monday? 905 for 5. Be like, but I'm going to die.
Yeah, and it's 200 over your raw.
Right. Oops.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So
now that point about systemic stress is huge. You're going to notice that all of this really just boils down to learning how to balance stress and recovery. You have to increase stress on some timeline to grow, but you also have to account for recovery and what exercises you're doing, where you're at as far as experience goes, what you're actually training for. Those are all going to require a different balance of stress and recovery. We see the exact same thing with like novice and advanced lifters. Advanced lifters, if you're squatting 900 pounds, your last heavy lift might be a full 4 weeks out from a meet, and then you have a long taper that allows you to recover. Whereas somebody who's brand new and squatting 95 pounds can literally hit a PR 2 days before a meet and be recovered enough to do it again because they're not as efficient. They're not capable of taxing their systems nearly as much. So with equipped lifting, because the weights you're handling are so far above what you can naturally handle on your own, the systemic stress is just insane. So you have to take that into account. That means you're not going to be able to just train in kind of an instinctive manner and expect to progress on the same timeline, because the hit to your joints and your nervous system and all of your other structures is just so much bigger. So this is really important to keep in mind when you're trying to evaluate how long it takes from a specific mode of training. I experience this with strongman events. I can do a reasonably heavy overhead press 7 to 9 days before a meet and I'm recovered, especially if it's for reps. My last deadlift workout, it's much heavier, much more taxing. So usually about 2 weeks out is my last one. Similarly with things like moving events, like stone loading and sandbag stuff, not that hard to recover from because they're inherently less efficient movements, but a fucking yoke where I'm loading up 1,000 pounds and like doing these like painful little stutter steps, just trying not to have my spine fall like a Jenga tower. That shit takes it out of me and I need a long time to recover from that. So keep in mind load, keep in mind total strain when you're considering how to balance stress and recovery in a workout. So now we're getting into this point where Mike kind of brings it all together, and he's going to cover right here the 3 big principles that make up all training. These are the foundational rocks of all modes of periodization, all training programs. And it's actually what I've written about before in blog posts and articles. I've made videos about this. I call it SRN, stress recovery novelty, but he's going to get into it right now.
At some point, you synthesize all of these systems and you take away from them concepts. When people say linear periodization, what I want to do is correct them and say, do you mean progression? Like adding difficulty over time? They're like, well, yeah, that's all we need from that system. That's it. That's all we need. Okay, that's great. Well, we have that. Then we have to make a recognition that if we just attack the same systems over and over, they could be overwhelmed and then they stop responding nearly as well, or you irritate various parts of your body because you're doing too much of the same shit. So then we introduce strategic variation. Mondays, you will do low bar squatting every other week. Every other week, you will do a high bar squat with a pause. That gives us just enough variation to progress both of those up, but also enough variation to where when you're just fucking sick and tired enough of high bar squats, next Monday's low bar again. You're like, oh my God, thank fucking God. I wasn't going to do any more fucking high bar squats. So that variation is strategic. So now we say, okay, we still have progression, great. Now we also have some variation, which is awesome.
Okay, so we just covered stress. You have to increase stress over time. That's the linearity aspect of it. But you also need variety or novelty. So what novelty does a couple of things. One, it prevents you from getting stale, prevents diminished returns. There's a psychological component there to keeping you engaged, but it's also physical. If you do the exact same movement in a similar threshold over and over and over, eventually you stop responding. So it's a way to keep you responding in a way that's just different enough that the training's useful, but similar enough to the thing you're trying to get better at that it's actually going to carry over to the end goal.
And then we say, okay, there's this other problem I'm getting into. I have really good sessions for maybe 4 or 5 weeks in a row. And then just something I don't even know what to call it. I'm just fucking tired. I don't want to train anymore. All of my joints hurt, bro. Joints I didn't even know I was fucking using. I wake up, my shoulder hurts. What the fuck? I just get injured in my sleep. And if you read about this in literature, you say, oh, this is a concept called accumulated fatigue. Which like, you just get fucking tired and beat up. It's the same analogy as like a really high level restaurant kitchen. Or just like a mushroom falls behind the grill and then it catches on fire and you blow it out. But like, you just can't, there's dust accumulates, all this other stuff. So every now and again, you have to clean the kitchen professionally. Other staff come in, they fucking clean everything and then you're good to go. So maybe every 4 or 5 weeks, every 3 weeks, every whatever, we have a week where the purpose is to reduce the fatigue. And then you can ask the question of how do we reduce fatigue? Well, is it by doing more training? Unlikely. Like, is it by doing a completely different kind of training that's still hard? No, because it's the hardness that really accumulates fatigue. Can you imagine if I was like, Dave, looked at your powerlifting plan, next week's deload, buddy, no heavy weights. You're like, oh, thank God I need it. And I was like, you're just going to run a marathon that week. Like, but I'm going to actually die. Like, it's different. Don't worry.
So the third component that he talks about is recovery. Again, it's balancing stress and recovery. So when I talk about it, SRN, stress recovery novelty, Mike just laid it out perfectly. He talked about linearity, increasing the stress, conjugation, rotating the movements, and then undulations, changing the volume and the intensity. And you can do that for some periods to actually increase the stress, but you can also do it in dedicated periods to reduce accumulated fatigue. And that restaurant analogy was really good because that's what happens. You train, you hit the gas over and over and over, and you start to accumulate where structures can't quite catch up. You're getting some adaptation over here, but some other structures can't recover enough. And then that all kind of comes to a head with psychological issues. You get disillusionment, lack of motivation, or aggression, which how are you going to keep advancing forward and hitting the gas if you don't have the psychological investment, but also physically, you actually stop adapting and you might even start to backslide. So this whole game is a balancing act. How do you balance the requirement of increasing stress with the need to make it sustainable by having certain amounts of recovery built into the program? And it just turns out it works really, really nice if you have training blocks, mesocycles that go 3, 4, sometimes 5 weeks where you're just getting after it. And then right when you hit that crescendo, right before that point of overtraining, that's when you peel back, let yourself recover, and then super compensation takes effect. It takes a lot of time to get that down. It takes a lot of time to know your body well enough and know your training enough to know, well, is it other life stuff that's running me down? Do I actually have more in the tank? Sometimes if you're not sleeping, if work gets crazy, you have a newborn, it might feel like you're overtraining, but it's actually just generally being tired. When your workouts are actually dialed in and you are getting after it, and every week it's go, 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 you're going to look for those signs where you come in and you're like, well, I should be recovered because I've had a week break since the last time I squatted, but my warm up at 35% moved like shit. It's like, okay, well, if that's not moving well, then I'm probably not going to have a good workout. And that's where you're due to try to build in those dedicated recovery periods. Now, for those that just put their head down and bulldoze through, that is a very specific type of training that some people do because they don't know any better. So if you just came up in the gym learning through trial and error, you might just think, hey, I've had periods of stagnation and I just put my head down and went, and eventually I broke through. That's also a thing because eventually those structures that are lagging behind will catch up, but that's obviously a less efficient way to do it. That's a way that requires much, much more effort when really all it would take is backing off a little bit and letting yourself catch up in the form of a deload or a wave reset. And it's also going to increase the likelihood that you get burnt out, that you want to take your ball and go home, that you don't want to do this anymore. That happens in Olympic lifting with like Bulgarian style training. Anybody who's trained with John Bros in like the Pat Mendes days when he was just pushing his lifters like crazy, he would talk about some of his most talented lifters just grabbing their bag and leaving one day saying, I can't do this anymore. So high cost to that, arguably less reward. That's not to say you can't do it, but there's going to be a cost and it might even end up with an injury or an overuse issue, which is why it's so important that you pay attention to this type of stuff.
So we realize, okay, we have some progressive components, linear components where we absolutely increase weight on the bar. And that's something I think that was missed from when we leaned in as a strength culture a little too much into a real extreme conjugate. Was people like, well, I should be adding to my lift over time. Like, yeah, just look that, your body will know. Like, no. You have to purposefully add 5 pounds when you fucking don't want to add 5 pounds. That's how you make real gains, especially towards the end of your career. So we have progressive element. We have a variation element. We don't do the same boring shit all the time, but that's still constrained within like, well, yeah, it's high bar or low bar, but it's still a good type of decent squat. It's not like one day I have you do high bar squat, another day low bar squat, and another day it's like round back, good morning. You're like, but that doesn't hit my ability to extend my knees. Like, yeah, don't worry about it. Like, no, it has to still make sense logically.
I wonder what Dave Tate really thought about that statement, because I swear that I've seen templates from the source of West Side style training that used like heavy hip extensions and squatting movements interchangeably. I mean, that was back in the days when no one was questioning Louis when he would say, you know, quads don't matter in the squat and stuff like that. So for Mike to say flat out, no, round back good mornings are useless for developing a big squat. I think that rhetoric has died down quite a bit. I think Dave has had enough time to like bring in other ideas and really kind of thoughtfully reflect on some of the more extreme ideas of like West Side style conjugate that didn't hold a lot of water. But I heard that and I just thought I would love to be a fly like inside of Dave's brain just to hear what he thought when Mike said that.
Now we have that, and we have a certain number of weeks we can go until we need to deload and reduce fatigue. man, we're fucking really onto something. Now we're starting to develop a structure that makes sense. Now, here's the thing. If it's raw powerlifting, the amount of variation you need is less. The amount of accumulative fatigue that rises is less because the weights are objectively lower. And it's really easy to train super specifically. It's hard to train super specifically for equip powerlifting because what are you going to do? Throw on the fucking gear every time?
Yeah.
That's a non-starter. It's fucking impossible. Now, you can rig some stuff with bands and chains that gets pretty close, but then again, even that's fucking annoying to rig, and even that breaks your body down in weird ways that you need the variation just from fucking breaking down.
Now, I think it's funny there that Mike basically said in his Mike, Mr. PhD, I have clout and people respect what I have to say. He said what large factions of the internet have been saying for a long time, and they say it in a more crude way, and that's it. Westside only works for geared lifters, bro. That was kind of the point he was making. He was saying geared lifters need more variation, where raw lifters don't need nearly as much. So all the bands and chains and grips and bars don't really matter quite as much for a raw lifter as they do with somebody who has to get in a suit where the bottom half is pure mechanical tension and the top half is just acceleration and pure lockout power. So that was a very interesting take right there, because I've gotten flamed in the past for saying something similar. Like, even though it doesn't only work for them, it might be best suited for them.
Mm-hmm. So you'd have more variation if you had an equipped powerlifter, less variation than if you had a raw powerlifter, but the principles are still the same. It's like if you have someone that comes into your restaurant, you're a cook, and you know they like a little bit more salt or less salt. It doesn't alter the principles of cooking. That just lets you move one of the bars up or down. So for me, I had to get a fucking PhD to understand all this shit to really make sense of it, so I could come back to other people and say, hey, training's kind of mysterious, but if we just look at it calmly for a while, we can distill it into a set of dependable principles that after you look back at training, you have a list of needs for the kind of sport your athlete that you're helping is interested in. And you can weave together training that at the very least just makes some fucking basic sense.
Wise words from Mike Israetel. And this is summed up at the end of the first installment of There's One Type of Periodization. There are three major elements that we use to define how plans are periodized: undulation, linearity, and conjugation. And those are basically placeholders for stress, recovery, and novelty. Undulation, changing the training volume and/or intensity, and that includes dropping it back when you need to recover. Linearity, which means progressing a training stress forward, so you have even increments that have a straight line trajectory. And then conjugation, regularly changing the training stressors. All of those have to be apparent in some capacity, no matter the program. And then it's kind of funny, it goes down to extremes like pure linear periodization, no changes in exercise ever. Well, obviously that doesn't exist. Pure conjugate periodization, exercises change all the time. Again, wrap in the bands and chains around your neck while you 19 board press. That's the secret. And that's about it. Nothing else changes, because if it's pure, there's no undulation or linearity. And then pure undulating periodization, no changes in exercises, and the overall average volume and intensity has to remain the same. So, of course, those are all ridiculous, which supports his hypothesis that all of these things exist everywhere. It's just a matter of dosing. It's like, how much salt do you want in your food? But I thought this was a really interesting, really valuable clip from this podcast. Another reason why there's so much value in listening to sources like this. It takes a long time, but eventually, like he says, you synthesize. You look at different programs, you listen to different experts, and eventually you get this kind of bird's eye view where all the pieces fit together and make sense, and it makes it much more easy to make decisions in your own training. So that's all I've got for today. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to check out Patreon. And if you want daily updates to my training, I post those daily with commentary. I answer questions. I engage with people. If you want to get a hold of me, that is the most direct way to do it. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Till next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.